Hey there, I wanted to take a brief moment and welcome you to the Focus Point podcast. If this is one of the first episodes that you're hearing from us, please head over to our website, thepointoffocus.com, where you can find out some more information about who we are, what we're doing. You can also find other podcast episodes and blog posts there as well. That's thepointoffocus.com. I'm so glad that you decided to give one of our episodes a listen. I really hope that you will be blessed and encouraged through what you hear in this episode. I also encourage you to share this episode with your family and your friends. Once again, I just thank you for taking some time and listening to our episode. Now, let's dive in to today's episode. Well, today's episode, we reach our first big milestone of the series Shining Light as we're going through the Gospel of John. What I mean by milestone is we're finishing our first section. Today we are going to close out the prologue of this gospel, and I'm excited to just dive into this last little bit. So if you have a copy of the Bible, you can go ahead and open it on up. That Bible can be paper or electronic. We're not picky. And you can open it on up to John chapter 1. In John chapter 1, we will start in verse 15. As we've been doing over the last couple weeks, we will read the prologue in its entirety. But because we're closing it out, and some of the stuff that I want to touch on at the end of the episode, we're going to close out this episode by reading the prologue at that time in its entirety. And so as we kind of look back a little bit about where we're going, we'll do that a little bit. But last week, if you didn't catch last week's episode, I wanted to just kind of touch in on that episode again as we begin to go close this out. But the verse 14 was just so strong, and we spent an entire episode just talking about it and the different things that Jesus being human and being God is vitally important to this gospel and to our own personal life. I shared a story where I have really felt my connection with Jesus strengthen as I've looked at this humanity of Jesus. Something that we can often sometimes maybe gloss over or not understand fully because it's a paradoxical statement, right? Fully God and fully man. How can you be both God and man, right? And so, but when we look at the different little spots of where John especially, but the other Gospels, they shine light on Jesus' humanity. They make sure that they put it in. John does a couple big ones where he makes sure that we notice that he's human and that a lot of the things he's dealing with in life are human based and that we can relate to. That's what makes him a good example for us in life. That he's dealt with a lot of the same things that we have. And so that's something that was in last week's episode. If you want to see that episode or hear that episode, it's all in our archive as well as all the other ones that we've done so far in this Shining Light series. And so, well, before we continue, just a little bit more. We're closing out the prologue, and then we're gonna, leading up to Easter, we're gonna finish chapter 1, and then we're going to not take a break from Shining Light, but we're going to take a break from Shining Light, I guess, and go into a new series as we go into Holy Week called Doubt. And in that series, we're going to look at John 18 through 21. So we're kind of doing some stuff, I guess, backwards, but it seems fitting to, as we're just getting started, before we really get into the content of the Gospel of John. John chapter 1 is still talking about John's testimony, the first disciples, and things like that, which is all important stuff. But when we get into John 2, we start seeing the signs that John puts in, where the things that he shines light on so that we can start to know who Jesus is and all of that. And so before we get started in that, and as we're planning out the schedule, there's not enough time to it's just getting into a little bit, and then we have to go into Holy Week. And instead of going to another gospel or something else, I thought it would be fun just for us to dive into Holy Week and go through that and stay in the last few chapters of the Gospel of John until we finish those, and then we will return to John 2 later on. So that's kind of just a little bit about where we're going here in this series, and it's really kind of exciting. I'm excited to keep going as we dive in. So as we close out John chapter 1, verse 15, and it says, John testified about him when he shouted to the crowds, "This is the one I was talking about when I said, 'Someone is coming after me who is greater than I am, for he existed long before me.' From his abundance we all have received one gracious blessing after another. For the law given through Moses, for the law was given through Moses, but God's unfailing love and faithfulness came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the unique one, who is himself God, is near to the Father's heart, and he has revealed God to us." So, just starting off, the very first simple thing that in this prologue, John kind of calls back to things that he's already kind of said, and just is this point of view that he's writing from, and this encompassing text that he's writing. But John the Baptist was saying here that Jesus has pretty much always existed, and that calls back to the very first verses of the prologue that we looked at, verses 1 through 3. And as I said, you can go check all these episodes out in the archive. But we see this, and this was the pre-existence of Jesus. He knew that Jesus was coming after him, right? But he also knew that Jesus was before him, because he says, "Someone is coming after me," right? And he existed before me. So when we see those two things, so Jesus is before and after, he's the beginning and the end, the Alpha, the Omega, all these different things. And we see that John is stating this, that Jesus is eternal. Jesus is transcendent. Jesus is forever. Jesus is immortal. Jesus is God, and Jesus is man, and Jesus is just Jesus, right? He's before and after. This is the point that John is trying to make. That long before we ever existed, now and back then, back to his audience that he was even writing, and back to the people that he was saying this to, this is vitally important for us to understand that Jesus has always existed. This is a thing that, as I mentioned in the very first episode of this series, people ask me, how could God have just, someone had to create, how could God always just... John has said it now twice, maybe more, but at least he said it in the first few verses of this, and now he's saying it here in the closing verses of the prologue, that he is eternal, that Jesus existed back then, and he exists now, and he exists into the future. This is the time of Jesus. He was saying that John the Baptist was saying that Jesus will exist long after I'm even around. And Jesus will exist long after you and I are around. Jesus will exist long after our generations after generation after generation. Jesus will exist because that's who he is. And so that's what he's saying in verse 15. But then John goes on into verse 16, and he talks about this idea of grace over the law. We now have entered this part where, because of Jesus, we now are in this time of grace. Unfailing love and faithfulness, as it's worded here in this translation of the Bible. But it says, from his abundance, we have received one gracious blessing after another. Grace after grace after grace after grace. That is what John is saying. Even though we mess up, even though we don't get it all together, even though we haven't figured it all out, this is the time that we now live in grace. And that Jesus has covered all of this. And it may be controversial to say that, but that's what it is. We live in grace because of what Jesus did. And it says right there that the law was given through Moses. So this is the the idea that the law was back then and that Jesus fulfilled that, as we see in the gospel accounts, that Jesus fulfilled the law, and now that we're in this grace, this unfailing love and faithfulness. God's unfailing love and faithfulness. This is meaning that Jesus was fixing a lot of the things that God wanted to make right. Jesus was fixing the problem of the law system, because it came into having to fulfill all these laws, and it wasn't this new thing was this endless supply of grace. That's what, and it got rid of the rigid laws and regulations that they had to follow in Moses. This is where you can see that people get kind of tripped up over the fact that, well, what about back there? What about all this stuff? What about these different rules and these different things? Jesus fulfilled all of that. Now, the Old Testament is full of things that we should want to follow, rules and regulations. Some of them don't pertain to us because it was during their cultural times, but there are some moral things that are in the Old Testament that should touch our hearts and that should be present in our lives and that we should want to follow. And then there's also things that Jesus definitely repeats in the New Testament under this new covenant, under this new grace, that are pretty important stuff. And so when we think about the Old Testament, yeah, there's a lot of this, as my notes say, this rigid law and that kind of stuff. So this idea of grace, and it was a contrast, right? They had to do this law thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about the sacrifice system that was put into place, because even still, at this point, people had to pay for something had to die to pay for sin. The wages of sin is death, and at this point, they were still doing that sacrifice system. And as I said, we'll talk about that a little bit more in length in a couple of episodes, but that was how God handled the payment for sin, is they would go on the Day of Atonement and they would do this sacrifice, and that's how they would be cleansed of their sins. But this is this unfailing love and faithfulness. This is now a new thing that John is talking about, that Jesus was going to do. God's grace to his people is continuous and never ending. Grace knows no interruption and no limit. And that is what is so important here. That we are now living in grace, the grace of God, that he sent Jesus to die for us so that we can have life in his name. And that this grace doesn't end. There's no 3 strikes and you're out or anything like that. It doesn't. We should check ourselves, and we shouldn't just be kind of like, well, God's going to forgive me anyway, so I can just do this. It'll be okay. I'll just ask for forgiveness. That is not the way to approach it either. Well, God's going to just forgive me anyway. God's just going to do that. God's grace is endless. God's grace, and it's just one of those things that is not the way to look at it. But God's grace is endless. He sent Jesus, and he's constantly given us goodness and mercy, grace, unfailing love and faithfulness, grace. He's doing that for us through Jesus. Now, verse 18, John really opens up the door, and he says something that is very powerful and eye-opening, and it's a thought that maybe sometimes we don't think about unless we read this verse. So verse 18 says, "No one has ever seen God, but the unique one, who is himself God, is near to the Father's heart. He has revealed God to us." So when we see that now, Jesus is the perfect declaration of the unseen God. Jesus is God, the representation of God in human form. The Father and the Son belong to the same family, and Jesus has declared the nature of the unseen God to man. John is shining light on us here to say that when we see Jesus, or let's back up a little bit. When they see Jesus, when they had seen Jesus, okay, because this is interacting with the fact that John is writing this after all these events, right? So when he's writing this prologue, he says, Jesus has revealed God to us, right? So he's saying that now we have seen who God really is. Even though we've never seen God, we've seen God through Jesus. And then for us, we've seen God through the actions of Jesus. We've seen God through the way Jesus acted, the way he's behaved, the stuff he went through. All of that is how we've seen God, even though we've never seen him, even though we've never seen Jesus either. We've seen Jesus by the accounts that John wrote, that Matthew wrote, that Mark wrote, that Luke wrote. This is how we've seen Jesus. This is how we've seen how we should act. And that makes our faith something new than the people that had faith because they've seen, right? And we're going to talk about that in a couple weeks around Holy Week as we talk about doubt. We're gonna see that come up, right? But the whole thing is that this is important, that we have faith in the things that Jesus has done because of what they've wrote down in the Gospels, and that's the only way that we have fully seen Jesus, is by the things that we've seen in the Gospels. His miracles, his heart, his compassion, his love, his sorrow, his joy, his sadness, all of these different things that we've seen. This is how we've seen Jesus. And by seeing Jesus through these words, we've seen God. And that is so strong and so powerful. And we don't have to wonder about the nature and personality of God, because Jesus has declared it with both his teachings and his life. What I just got done saying, summed up in a nutshell. We don't have to wonder about who God is because we've seen it through Jesus. And that's what John is saying to, John the Baptist, is saying to the people. And that's what John, the gospel writer, is saying to the people. And so as we close out this prologue, a few notes that we should say, and some of this was in the first episode as we kind of opened up some of this was in our introductory time for the episode. I don't remember if we did that in the first episode of the Shining Light series or if we did that in our Word of the Year episode. Anyway, it's back there in the archive. You can go back there. But John wrote this gospel after he'd spent time with Jesus. This is an eyewitness account. This was John experienced Jesus, and he wrote it down so that we may know Jesus, so that we may have life by the power of his name. That's a resounding theme. And that's why we've called this series Shining Light, because as we go through the Gospel of John, John specifically shines light on the things that he wants us to know about Jesus, right? Not just his teaching and not just how he lived his life, but these different things that zero in just a little bit more on Jesus. And the words here that John wrote, as we can kind of see, he says things like, he has revealed God to us, and the tone of the language that he uses is written from a point where he's already experienced it, right? So he's saying, John testified, there was a man and John and all this stuff like that. So he's telling a story, basically. He's thinking about different events, and he's writing them down as he goes through, and that's why this prologue reads the way that it does. Almost like he's experienced these things already. He's not writing it down so people will know what to experience. It's already been experienced. And that is something that when you read this and spend some time in it, as we have over the last couple weeks, we can see that John has written this down. And really, the words that John wrote in the prologue sum up what's coming up in the whole gospel, right? He's shining light on Jesus. And this is an interesting thing, that while at the same time, the prologue here, I believe, is its own gospel message. That the things that we read in the prologue and how we see the prologue, and it tells us about God. It tells us about people who've testified about him. It tells, John, right? So it shows how we should handle what we know about Jesus, right? John testified about him, and we're going to see more about John in the coming episodes. But what I find is that then he tells about what Jesus did, and then he tells about what Jesus is going to do, right? Through his unfailing, it says here, through his unfailing love and faithfulness, right? We have received one gracious blessing after another. Grace upon, right? We've received this thing that we didn't deserve. This goodness and mercy, this grace and truth, this unfailing love and faithfulness. That God would be faithful enough to us that he would try to figure out how we could reconcile that relationship that we messed up. Totally undeserving of it. The consequences that we experience, right, because of what happened in the Garden of Eden and subsequent things as we've continued on through the history of life from generations to generations to generations to generations, that we would come right back to this and be undeserving of this. It's almost like a natural consequences thing. I don't know if you do it, but sometimes with kids, like sometimes the best way to learn is from natural consequences. But here in this case, because of our sin and because of our disconnection with God and no way to bridge that gap, our natural consequence is death. And that's not good enough for God. God doesn't want anybody to perish. He wants to have everybody to have everlasting life. He wants everybody to have life in his name. That is what God wants. That is God's heart. And so he doesn't want us to end up with our natural consequences fate. So he sent Jesus, who became human and made his home among us, as it says, and shines light in the darkness, and so that we have the ability to choose light and darkness and turn the light on, turn the light back on, all the different things that we've talked about in these first few episodes of this series. And the exciting thing comes from reading this prologue, and as I've said, we see so that gracious blessing, right? The death of Jesus, what we've already read in our theme verse, have life of the power of his name, and then the big thing is that because of this, we've seen God. We've not physically seen him, but we've seen him through words and the actions and the life of Jesus. It's so powerful and strong to me in this prologue. And that is what John leaves us with before he goes in. And as I said, next week we're going into a little bit about John the Baptist, his testimony, and all of that. And it's going to be a really exciting time as we continue on. But as I said at the beginning of this episode, to close out this episode, so I hope you come back. I want to do a little bit of housekeeping here because when we read the prologue, the episode will be over. So I hope you come back as we continue on in the Shining Light series. Where next week we're kind of going to go into the next section of the gospel. I'm really excited to continue. As I said, this is something that God has laid on my heart for a while, that I should do the Gospel of John, and it just hasn't really fit in. And when I say fit in, I haven't felt it right yet. And so I felt God was like, this is the right time. And so, as I said, we're reading from the New Living Translation. So if you want to get a copy of the Bible, it reads in any, you can follow along really in any translation, but we typically use the New Living Translation here on this podcast. So, as I said, we're going to read this. The episode will be over. I hope you'll come back next week as we continue on in this series. As I said, on Palm Sunday, we'll be doing a special Palm Sunday episode, but then on that Good Friday, we'll be starting a series called Doubt. And just to kind of get you thinking toward that, Holy Week is just a little over a month away. And so I'm excited to continue diving into the Gospel of John. So without further things to say, let's dive into this prologue one final time. And as I said, I hope to see you guys next week. So it says here, the prologue of John chapter 1, it says, "In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He existed in the beginning with God, and God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. God sent a man, John the Baptist, to tell about the light so that everyone might believe because of his testimony. John himself was not the light, but he was simply a witness to tell about the light. The one who was the true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming to the world. He came into the very world he created, but the world did not recognize him. He came to his own people, and they even rejected him. But to all who believed in him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. They are reborn, not with a physical birth resulting from human passion or plan, but a birth that comes from God. So the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of God, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. John testified about him when he shouted to the crowds, "This is the one I was talking about when I said, 'Someone is coming after me, who is far greater than I am, for he existed long before me.' From his abundance we all have received one gracious blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, but God's unfailing love and faithfulness came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the unique one, who is God himself, is near to the Father's heart. He has revealed God to us."